I'm officially bringing you all to all of my speaking engagements. I gotta confess, this was such a hard topic for me to prepare for. Jesus and justice. And I mean it legitimately. It was like really hard. And I'm racking my brain and I'm wondering why. And part of it is, I talk about it so often. Can you go back to the foundations and make those explicit? But there's another part that I think is even more fundamental to why this was so difficult to prepare for, talking about Jesus and justice. And it's for one simple reason. I reject the premise. I reject the framing. I reject the false dichotomy between Jesus and justice. It's not a question that I want to wrestle with because I don't think it's proposed by good faith actors. There's a sense in which we should simply be able to say Jesus and the justice part is implied. The justice part is assumed. I reject the premise that there would be some sort of dichotomy between Jesus and justice, as if it's one or the other, as if pursuing one meant you couldn't pursue the other, when nothing could be further from the truth. And the reality is you cannot have one without the other, Jesus and justice. This is the first lesson, I think, that we should carry with us today. We are often having these conversations around a question, should Christians do justice? The Bible said we should move on from spiritual milk and desire solid food. So the question is not, should Christians do justice? The only question is, how should Christians do justice? You see the subtle framing shift there. Should Christian do justice begs the question of whether it is within the purview of people of faith to pursue justice. And I'll talk just about what justice means in a moment. And when we say, should Christians do justice, it begs the question, ought we to get involved? Ought we to get involved? But when you say, how should Christians do justice? You see what that assumes? Oh, you doing justice. The only question is, in what manner? In what way? So let's move on to some spiritual solid food today. And when somebody asks you, should Christians do justice? When somebody proposes to you that there is some sort of dichotomy between Jesus and justice, you say, no, baby. The question is not should we. The question is how we do justice. Now, basically, I want to approach this topic with one point, hopefully, that you get. It's maybe a little bit sideways, but this is what keeps me going in justice, in doing justice. I don't want to simply make the case that Christians should pursue justice. You should. All my cards on the table. I want to make the case that when you pursue justice, you get more of Jesus. When you pursue justice, you get more of Jesus. Now, I'm going to get there, but first we got to build a case, all right? We got to go on a little bit of a journey. So number one, I want to make sure that we understand what is justice. I mean, we use that word all the time. Let's pause, let's define our terms. So I'll briefly explicate what I mean when I say justice. Then I want to talk about 3 obstacles to pursuing justice, what that looks like, especially among our white brethren and sistren. We can talk honestly, right? Yeah. Can we go there on today? All right, I'm just making sure. And then we'll get to how pursuing justice gets you more of Jesus. All right, so let's begin. What is justice? Well, first of all, before I go further, this is the beginning of a conversation. I'm going to do shameless self-promotion because when black folk try to do stuff, don't nobody lift us up unless we lift us up. And I'm going to say, you can bring out your phone right now. I won't mind. I won't take offense. And if you scan that QR code, it's going to take you to my Substack. What is Substack? It's a newsletter on steroids. So instead of scrolling through and hoping you find an article worth reading, you can go directly to it through this. You can sign up for free, or if you want to support my work, you can become a paid subscriber. In a couple of weeks, I'm doing an online event just for Substack subscribers called Preparing Our Souls for the Election. Preparing our souls for the election. And the only way you can get on that is if you're a subscriber to my Substack. So, moving on. What is justice? It's just jemartisby.substack.com if you need it. What is justice? Before I go further, I find it helpful to define these terms. And the Bible gives us ample definitions and explications. I like the one from Psalm 11 and verse 7. If somebody ever comes to you and said, well, Christians shouldn't be getting in all that justice stuff, that's woke. Just say, well, what about Psalm 11 and verse 7? For the Lord is righteous, God loves justice. And the upright will see God's face. My. Okay, so you're mad about me talking about racial equity and equality. Well, what do you do with the fact that the Bible says that God loves justice? What I like about this verse is it does something that you see a few different times in Scripture. It pairs righteousness and justice. And I wondered to myself, what is the relationship between righteousness and justice? Are they synonyms, just meant to amplify a point? Are they complementary, different, but somehow they go together? And I think it is the latter. Now, Dr. Gushy, please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just a humble old preacher right here. I don't have all the degrees that you do, but from what my complicated definition of righteousness, something I can remember, is simply this: righteousness is that which is right. I know you may need to take note on that one. Righteousness is that which is right. What I mean is, God is a God who does right. God is a God of righteousness. That is to say that when God set up the world, God set it up to function a certain way, a way that would lead to flourishing, a way that would lead to dignity, a way that would lead to honoring all of humanity and creation. That is righteousness. Now, when we think of righteousness, we can also think of morality and ethics. And sometimes I like to use people's words and use it in a different way than they even knew or intended. So there's this thing called a catechism, which is a teaching tool. It's a question and answer format designed to teach new converts or even children the basics of the faith. Now, there's this catechism that was written hundreds of years ago in Europe by a bunch of British and English white men who didn't have anybody who wasn't white on their minds. But here's the way that God works. He says, sometimes I draw straight lines with crooked sticks, that even though racism may have been a part of their churches, here's what they did. They wrote in the catechism about the 10 commandments. And you remember the 6th commandment, right? No, I'm just kidding. I wouldn't have remembered. The 6th commandment, right? Thou shalt not kill, or thou shalt not murder, right? And it says in this catechism that what is required from that commandment, and watch what's required. We think thou shalt not kill. That's pretty straightforward, right? Oh yeah, but let's go further. What is required are charitable thoughts, love, compassion, meekness, gentleness, kindness, peaceable mind, and courteous speeches and behavior, forbearance, readiness to be reconciled, patient bearing and forgiving of injuries, and requiting good for evil, comforting and sustaining the distressed, and protecting and defending the innocent are all required in thou shalt not kill. What is forbidden? What can you not do based on that commandment? The neglecting or withdrawing the lawful means necessary for the preservation of life. Sinful anger, hatred, envy, desire for revenge, provoking words, oppression. You know how they like to say oppression is a woke word? Oppression is in the Bible, y'all. Quarreling, striking, wounding, and I like this part, whatsoever else tends to the destruction of the life of any. You know how I would use that? Where is the factory being placed? Where will the pollution go? In which neighborhood? Where are you building the bridge or the highway? Are you granting adequate health care to people? Whatsoever tends to the destruction of the life of any is forbidden in the commandment, thou shalt not kill. God is a God of righteousness. God tells us what is right. God shows us what righteousness looks like. But as I don't have to tell you, we don't always do right. And that brings us to our definition of justice. Justice is what we need when righteousness is absent. Righteousness is the way God set up the world to function a certain way, for human beings to treat each other a certain way. But when we go wrong, then we need justice. Justice means making things right or making things righteous. If righteousness is what is right, then justice is what we need when the world is not right. Should Christians do justice? The other way to ask that is the world exactly the way it should be according to God's righteous standard? No? Then we need justice. Now, there's another way of thinking about justice, and that is justice is giving people what they deserve. Now, this is in both the positive and the negative sense. In the positive sense, that means literally giving people what they deserve as beings made in the image and likeness of God. That is food, that is shelter, that is clothing, that is freedom. That is the ability, all the basic necessities that we need to flourish. Martin Luther King, toward the end of his life, he was not very popular. One of the reasons he wasn't popular is because he started talking about redistribution of wealth. He said at some point we may need something like universal basic income. He said that it just ain't right or righteous that in the wealthiest nation on the planet there should be any poor among us. In the positive sense. Also in a negative sense, or in terms of consequences for doing wrong. Justice is necessary as accountability for not being righteous. That's why we call it aspirationally the criminal justice system. In activist circles, they call it the criminal legal system. Because in an imperfect system, justice is not always done. So we've talked about righteousness. That which is right. We've talked about justice, what we need when righteousness is absent, or making things right, or giving people what they deserve. With this basic definition of justice, we can proceed. And I want to talk about 3 obstacles to pursuing justice. I'm going to do my good Baptist preacher alliteration. 3 obstacles to pursuing justice: individualism, isolation, and intimidation. Individualism, isolation, and intimidation. Earlier, I I want to talk about, we'll move on to this. Let's talk about individualism. If I could get all the white people in a room and tell them one thing about race, it would be this. Racism is not just individual, interpersonal, attitudinal. Racism is also institutional, systemic, and structural. Racism is not just individual, interpersonal, and attitudinal. Racism is also institutional, structural, and systemic. All right? So I'm leaning on wisdom from social scientists here, Michael Emerson and Christian Smith. You may be familiar with their book, Divided by Faith. One of the parts of the many that I appreciate about that book is they talk about what makes it so darn hard for white Christians and white evangelicals in particular to be effective with racial justice. And they talk about something called the white evangelical toolkit. Now, even if you're not white, even if you're not evangelical, you need to know the operating system of some of the people who will oppose you. So in the white evangelical toolkit, they have three main tenets: free will individualism, anti-structuralism, and relationalism. Now, this is all falling broadly under the category of individualism. Let's talk about the white evangelical toolkit under the heading of individualism as an obstacle to pursuing racial justice. So what is one, free will individualism? Free will individualism is the idea that, quote, individuals exist, get this, independent of structures and institutions. They have free will and are individually accountable for their own actions. I'll say it again. Individuals exist independently of structures and institutions, have free will, are individually accountable for their own actions. Now, the effect for white evangelicals is that the individual is the central unit for understanding society. Therefore, it reduces the importance of communities and institutions in shaping the ways people think and behave. They don't think, by and large, that their churches, their neighborhoods, their schools are exerting much of an influence on how they think, speak, and act. They are free will individuals making choices for themselves independently. Which is why, by the way, this is a bonus just because I like y'all. When I was in seminary, all theology was just theology until it was black theology, or Latin American theology, or liberation theology. And the subtext of that was theology arising from European or white people was objective. Objective. Because they didn't have a context. Because they were free will individuals. So that when they came to the Bible and when they came to theology, it was purely intellectual and scientific. No systems, no structures exerted a force on the way they interpreted the Bible or understood God. But with all y'all other folks, you're not objective, you're biased. Because they see themselves as free will individuals. Secondly, relationalism. A strong emphasis on personal relationships. That doesn't sound bad. But the effect is this. White evangelicals tend to think of race problems fundamentally are caused by poor relationships. Thus, racism is largely individually based. In other words, the way many white evangelicals understand racism is this: if the problem is broken relationships. So the solution is, I'm nice to black people. Some of my best friends are black. I can't be racist. Why? Because they're looking at racism through a relational, purely lens. Now, there is a relational aspect to race and racism, but that is necessary but not sufficient. You do have to change your interpersonal relationships, but if you think that's it, then you get the state of the church today. This is why so often the solution in many of our churches and many of our Christian nonprofits is, let's just get people together. Let's have this heart-to-heart over a cup of coffee or tea. Let's have the meeting and the discussion and form the committee and all. Kumbaya, my Lord. You know. Now, don't get me wrong. That ain't wrong in and of itself. But if that's as far as you go, then you haven't gone far enough. And that leads to the third aspect of the white evangelical toolkit, anti-structuralism. Anti-structuralism means that invoking social structures shifts guilt away from its root source, the accountable individual. So that's the flip side of free will individualism. If everything is about me and my choices, then don't come at me with any of this structural, systemic, institutional stuff, because that means I don't have the free will that I thought I did. It means I might be affected by the context and the structures around me. It means you're taking responsibility away from the individual. So when you look at the modern landscape around racial justice, what are the objections that you see? Systemic racism isn't real. That's woke. That's critical race theory. That's DEI. What's going on there is anti-structuralism. They don't want to entertain the notion that racism can be embedded into systems, policies, and procedures, our everyday way of life, such that when you set it going and the system operates as it was designed, you don't need anyone in a dark office twirling their mustache saying, he, how can I be racist today? All you need is for the system to operate as it was intended. It's anti-structuralism, and black people are over here hollering law enforcement, mass incarceration, funding of education, health care, the system. And the response is, it's a few bad apples. That is anti-structuralism. By the way, all of this toolkit, the free will individualism, the relationalism, the anti-structuralism, that's why you will seldom hear me use the phrase racial reconciliation, and I more often use the term racial justice. And I got nothing against the term or the people who use it. And as a matter of fact, racial reconciliation is a Bible word, and I'm not giving up on it. I like what it says in 2 Corinthians 5:18. All this is from God, who reconciled us to God through Christ and gave us the ministry of what? Reconciliation. It's a Bible word. Nothing wrong with reconciliation. What's wrong is what white evangelicals have done with it. The way they've used, misused, defined, and redefined the term. So I don't avoid the term racial reconciliation because it's not good and right and true. It's right there in the Word of God. But I don't use the term because of what the term has come to mean. The term has come to mean, let's get different hues in the pews. The term has come to mean, let's approach racism purely on a relational end. But let's not deal with the structural and institutional and policy and systemic manifestations of racism. But that's what I think that word justice gets to. And I know of what I speak personally because you remember back in 2014, 2015, Mike Brown is killed, and then Black Lives Matter becomes the new banner under which this phase of the Black freedom struggle marches under. And when we said Black Lives Matter, they said all lives matter. I came to find out in many white Christian circles, they wanted our presence, but not our perspective. They wanted us on the brochure, but not in the boardroom. They didn't want integration, they wanted assimilation. And so I say racial justice. So we are now in the section where I'm talking about 3 obstacles to pursuing justice. The first is individualism. The second is isolation. Now, we had some technical issues. Let me see if this will work. We don't have the visual, but hopefully the audio will do the trick.
We live in a crazy time with Dr. King and Mr. Mandela's dreams are coming true. Black people and white people and Asians and Indians, and everybody's hanging out together. Have interracial posses. It's unbelievable what's going on, man. Unbelievable. All my black friends have a bunch of white friends. And all my white friends have one black friend.
You know, the comedians are the truth tellers. I often wonder when white people say, some of my best friends are black. Do those black friends say that about you? I mean, I can imagine a scenario when somebody says that about me, and I'm like, bro, I ain't even got your phone number. What are you talking about? We best friends. Okay. We often have this conversation about Jesus and justice, or Jesus or justice, or Jesus versus justice. We often even are forced to have this conversation because the question is coming from people who are highly isolated. Now, the old-fashioned term for this is segregated. But I had to keep the alliteration, the isolation. The isolation. And I would like to propose to you that folks are isolated in at least 3 ways that make it difficult to pursue racial justice. They are isolated relationally, they are isolated epistemologically, and they are isolated ecclesiastically. They are isolated relationally, epistemologically, and ecclesiastically. I like this study by the Public Religion Research Institute that showed the racial composition of friend networks. What they did in this study was they said, imagine you have 100 friends. What would be the racial and ethnic breakdown of those 100 friends? Among white Americans, 90% of people comprising their social networks are also white. You didn't hear me. Among white Americans, 90% of people comprising their social networks are also white. The average white person, if they have 10 friends, 9 of them are white. If they have 100 friends, 90 of them are white. And those other 10 ain't all black. Those other 10 is everybody else. Now, the racial homogeneity of your social network is always majority, whatever your race or ethnicity is. Why? Because we tend to marry within our groups and live within our groups. So, among black Americans, 78% of people in our social networks are also black, but that's down from 83% in 2013. Among Hispanic Americans, it is 63% of their core social networks also Hispanic. And among Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, AAPI, 65% of their core social networks are also AAPI. Isolation. Here's another data point. On average, white folks' social networks are about 90% white, but there are some whose social networks are entirely white. In 2022, 67% of white Americans have networks that are entirely white. 2/3 of white people have social networks that are all white people. And you want to talk to them about racial justice. Contrast with black Americans, which have diversified the most, less than half, 46%, are composed entirely of people who are also black. This is why white folks must listen to black folks on race. You don't know us, but we know you. That's just what the social networking says. If 2/3 of white people, your entire network is white, if for a majority of white people, 90% of your network is white, and for black people, less than half of our network is black, that means we are interacting with white people because we have to. We have to when we apply for schools. We have to when we apply for jobs. We have to when we go for a loan. We have to interact with you in meaningful ways because y'all run things, which wasn't because you earned it. I thought you said we could talk honestly, okay? Let me put it this way. Let me, because you didn't earn it all. Right? You gotta interrogate why we've had one black president and no women. You gotta interrogate why the wealthiest people are still white in the United States. You gotta interrogate why the schools with the best resources are in predominantly white neighborhoods. Is it really because white people are just that much better? Let me give you a hint. That would be racist. To assume the superiority of a single race, they call that white supremacy. Also, to assume the inferiority of any other race. All right? So all I'm saying is, because of the way our social networks are comprised, which part is numeric? There's more white people than other racial groups, but part of it is on purpose. Restrictive covenants and redlining and white flight and all those things. White people, if you're really good at anything, it is getting as far away from black and brown people as you can. So guess what? You're going to have to go out of your way instead of building walls to build bridges. Did I say out of your way? Because in the normal course of things, the way this society in the United States has been set up for hundreds of years, if you don't go out of your way, you will never get in the way of diversity. Ooh, somebody, I didn't even try to preach today. Listen. But that's not all. Our friend networks are divided along partisan lines too. Without getting into policy, we can talk about this. The core friendship networks of Republicans are on average 83% white. 83% white if you are a Republican, compared to 67% white among independents and 53% white among Democrats. Most Republicans are white. Therefore, if you identify as Republican, most of your network will be what? White. And it's still a majority for Democrats, but far less, 53% compared to 83%. But also, that's all Democrats, including black Democrats. That factors into the average. So let's extract just white folks. The core social network of white Democrats is 90% white. The core social network of white Republicans is 93% white. Do you know what that means? Isolation is a problem for liberals and conservatives who are white. I saw this up close and personal when I went to grad school at a public state university. History department's very liberal. We led the charge to bring down the state flag, which at the time was the only flag in the whole United States that still had the Confederate emblem on it. We were the last public university in the state of Mississippi to be flying that flag. At the entrance to the campus was a monument to a Confederate soldier, as if to say, welcome to the flagship university of the state of Mississippi with this Confederate soldier. We got that moved to a Confederate graveyard somewhere else on campus. So it's this liberal department. And yet, what I noticed was, number one, I was the only black person in my program, in the state with the highest proportion of black people of any state in the union. And number two, all these good liberal white people said the right things, but they didn't know any black people. Their convictions were theoretical. They were not relational. They knew things about black people, but they didn't know black people. 90% and 93% for Republicans. So this is a partisan divide on top of a racial divide. Isolation. Another form of isolation, I'll be brief with this, is epistemological. So one form of isolation is relationships. Who do you know? Another form is epistemological. What do you know? Where do you get your news and your information? This is a poll from YouGov. It says, Democrats are far more likely than Republicans to say they trust the news in general. And the same for specific news outlets. 81% of the 52 news sources they asked about, a greater share of Democrats trust them rather than distrust them. So 81% lean more toward trusting most news sources than distrusting them. When it comes to Republicans, just 25% lean toward trusting news outlets versus distrusting them, meaning they don't trust the news. They don't trust journalists. Now, not all of these outlets are created the same, for sure. But the problem of isolation is not just who do you know, it's where do you get your information. And increasingly, what's getting harder and harder in the information age is that people are leaning on sources that call themselves news, but are really just conspiracy theory factories. Have you ever tried to talk to someone who's deep down, say, the white Christian nationalist rabbit hole? Everything you say to them is alternative facts. They have some counter to it. Why? Because they are fed a steady diet of information that is not factual, that is not based in reality, that is not scientifically proven, but it is promoted as if it's true. So we don't even get our news from the same places. We face epistemological isolation. And then lastly, ecclesiastical isolation. That means churches. I'm sure you've heard that phrase, 11 o'clock a.m. on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. It actually might be more like 8 to 3 p.m. Monday through Friday when we send our kids to school, but that's another topic. In my first book, The Color of Compromise, I say there would be no black church without racism in the white church. There would be no black church without racism in the white church. What do I mean? What do I mean is that the separation that occurred along racial lines was not primarily due to doctrinal differences. It wasn't because folks were arguing over the Trinity or the deity of Christ. It was for one simple reason: black people did not want to be treated as second-class citizens in the household of God. They didn't want to come to church and be forced to sit in the balcony, which in the days before air conditioning, that's the hottest part of the church. Y'all like, balcony? Yeah, that's where I like to go. I get a good view. No, you sweat. They didn't like to be sent to the back of the church. They didn't like to be denied communion or served from a wholly different cup or elements because of their skin color. They wanted to be treated as equal human beings, full of dignity, full of honor, being made in the full image and likeness of God. And the only way we could do that was to form our own churches, which is also a sad commentary on white Christians at the time. Now, good news, that is shifting somewhat. There has been a rise in what we call multiracial churches, and this is just Jemar Tisby speaking. It's a bonus for y'all because I like you. I think historically we're living in a very unique time in terms of the church and race. I would trace it back to the late 80s and into the 90s would be the first time that multiracial churches were truly celebrated, at least by white people, in the history of our nation. Prior to that, they were anomalies. They were places that I wouldn't go. I wouldn't send my children there. But then there was this racial reconciliation movement leading to this multiracial church movement. And in the past 30-ish years, we've seen a rise in multiracial churches, that defined by no single racial or ethnic group comprises more than 80% of the congregation, which is a really low bar, but we got to start where we can start. The rise in multiracial churches, according to one study, there was 6% of those churches in 1998, 19% in 2019, so about triple. That's progress, right? So, Emerson didn't stop his sociological studies in 2000 when the book was published. In more recent studies, he's looked at it, and other sociologists have looked at it. In one article in NPR, Emerson is quoted as saying that this racial reshuffling of multiracial churches has been almost entirely one way. Quote, all the growth in multiracial churches has been people of color moving into white churches. We have seen zero change in the percentage of whites moving into churches of color. All the growth has been people of color moving into white churches. So it's black people sacrificing. It's black people moving. It's black people shifting and changing and going into predominantly white spaces. It is not white people going into predominantly black or brown or anyone else's spaces. It is still, we built this thing, y'all come. Rather than you have something that I may need to learn. That's not all. When you go into many of these multiracial churches, they are multiracial, but not multi-what? Cultural. So Corey L. Edwards wrote the book, The Elusive Dream, and she says, the cultures and structures of interracial churches emulate those more commonly observed in white churches. The cultures and structures emulate white churches. Interracial churches tend to cater to the predilection of whites. The worship styles and practices mainly suit the desires of whites. A white-centered, multiracial church. Still, a majority of pastors in multiracial churches are white. And even if your particular congregation has a person of color leading it, if you're part of a network or a denomination that is white-centered, that will also exert a pressure on your local congregation. Meaning your local congregation will go only so far as the powers that be beyond the church let it. So when you think of those two facts, that all the growth has been black people going to white churches, and then these even multiracial churches are still white-centered, that means black people are doing all the sacrificing and all the suffering for the sake of reconciliation. There's one more statement by Corey Edwards I think is important. She says, I would argue that the goal shouldn't be diversity. Rather, all churches are called to be places of justice. Uplifting the oppressed. That is what the Christian faith is. All churches, regardless of their racial and ethnic composition, should be like that. And then you can move toward integration. I like what she's saying there. Because when I think of the most integrated structures, they're often sports teams. What happens on a sports team is you are united in pursuit of a goal. You want to win the game or the match. You want to score. You want to win. It's a competition. And in pursuit of that shared goal, well, I need this person and that person and this person and that person. As a matter of fact, it's not bad that we're all different. As a matter of fact, it's essential that we're all different in order to achieve our goal. See, too often in multiracial churches, we make diversity the goal, which fundamentally is us circling chairs, looking inward and saying, do we got everybody represented here? And then what happens is, well, how do we make sure that we keep everybody here? Well, we can't tick anybody off. Which means we can't actually go there and say the thing and do the thing and take the action, because that's gonna make that other group mad, and that's gonna make that other group mad. And so the goal of multiracial churches, where diversity is the goal, is to keep the diversity. So you tiptoe and you backpedal and you water down because you want to keep the diversity in the circle. Rather, we need to get rid of the chairs. We need to stand up. We need to march in the same direction, and that direction is on the journey of justice. And when we get on that direction of that journey of justice, well, now you need to come along, and I need what you got to bring, and you need to come along. And diversity is not a distraction or a detraction. Diversity is something that we celebrate. Diversity is not the goal. Justice is the goal. And I'm almost done. The more I do this work, the more persuaded I am that what hinders the work of justice is not primarily people not getting on board with it, not an intellectual assent. Theoretically, people would say justice is a good thing. Yay, racial justice is a good thing. So why don't more people take action? And it boils down often to one word: fear. I'm convinced that most of what holds us back in the church from doing justice is not that we don't understand the concept, or even that we're opposed to it, but we are afraid. We are intimidated, particularly by the people who oppose justice. So I love being here at this event because of the theme and the topic, because of the gracious welcome of you all, but also because I don't get invited to speak like I used to. 2019, 2020, you remember that 2 minutes and 37 seconds everybody was paying attention to race? And then no sooner did the calendar change from 2020 to 2021 than you get January 6th, anti-critical race theory, anti-DEI, woke is all of a sudden a bad word. So for every halting, faltering step toward progress on the journey of racial justice, there is a backlash. Or some would say, white lash, right? And so what I've observed is that there are genuine racists out there. People who have evil and mischief in their hearts. But numerically, that's a small number. It's a small number that would have tied the noose or burned the cross. It's a small number that would have showed up in person on January 6th. The much larger number are the people held in check by fear of that much smaller number. So when I say I don't get invited much anymore, one of the places I used to speak most frequently were Christian colleges and universities. They don't call no more. And I don't think it's because, by and large, they're opposed to what I'm saying or the history or racial justice. They are afraid of being labeled woke. They are afraid of donors and trustees and presidents looking at those actions and saying, y'all are too far left, we're taking our money away. Fear. Now, I've seen this up close and personal with me. I went to a particular conservative college. Now, this was one of the far-right, fundamentalist kind of Christian colleges. And I spoke there. And I gave a series of talks. And one of them was in chapel. And, well, here's what I said in chapel. And you tell me if you think, how radical you think it was. This is speaking to a group of college students.
So, what can you do? Well, you happen to be in college, which is a season prime for building awareness. So concretely, what can you do? Take the classes. I don't care if it's about race or it has African American in the title and you think, oh, that's for them. No, it's for you. Go on the trips, attend the events, start the book club or the Bible study, watch the documentaries, follow the activists online and on social media. Fill your minds with an awareness of racial justice so that 5, 10, 20 years from now, you don't have to say, I never knew. Years down the road, you don't have to say, I wish I had known sooner. Now is the time. And you have access to immense knowledge, immense wisdom about race, racial justice, and the like. But I know there are fears. What if I get it wrong? What if I say the wrong things? What if they call me names? Brothers and sisters, remember what Mordecai tells Esther when she's facing real risk and danger at the prospect of standing up against injustice. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this.
So that was the punchline at the end of a 20-minute chapel message to undergraduate students. That was October 2020, just less than a month before the 2020 election. It wasn't until a full year later that somehow I stumbled upon this online petition calling to save the college from CRT. They wanted to save the college from critical race theory, and on this online petition, they put a series of proofs, of evidences of mission drift. One of them was that chapel message I preached. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not thin-skinned in this. I've been in it long enough to know that there's always going to be pushback and backlash, but this was a first for me, because what happened next was the Board of Trustees formed a subcommittee to study so-called mission drift at the college, and they were charged to produce a report. In this 23-page report, they wrote about me. Most of those in leadership with whom we spoke observed that the Jemar Tisby that we thought we invited in 2019 is not the Jemar Tisby that we heard in 2020, or that we now read about. And here's the bottom line in that report. They allow that in hindsight, inviting Mr. Tisby to speak in chapel was a mistake. Fear and intimidation. Well, what I said was radical. Hey, students, while you're in college, take classes and learn about race and history. Whoa! Inviting me to speak that message in chapel was a mistake. But don't you worry, I wrote an open letter. I put all their business out there. Because they made it official. So I had an official response. But the effect of that, because this made national news, the effect of that was for all these other Christian colleges and universities to say, I'm not touching that. Intimidation and fear. I'll give you one last story. This was far more severe than what happened to me. There was a professor at a conservative Christian college in Florida. He had been teaching there for 20 years. One day, he comes out of his class, and his dean and the provost are waiting for him in the hallway. If you're in higher education and you're a professor, you don't want to see your dean and the provost. They wait for his students to file out of the class, and they say, "Come on in, let's sit in your class." They hand him an envelope, and in the envelope it says that his contract renewal is being held pending a review of his curriculum. Mind you, he's taught there for 20 years. He was teaching a class on literature that was using racial justice themes and topics. What ended up happening was, as he was in the midst of teaching, one of the students went to their mother and said what he was saying. The mother then called the president of the college and accused the professor of, quote, indoctrination. That was enough to have his contract under review. To his credit, this professor went public and said, "Oh, no, 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 y'all are not going to do me dirty in the dark." Well, they really didn't like that. They really didn't like that. So I broke the story on my Substack. It eventually hit CNN, Newsweek, USA Today, all of these outlets. And he was fired. But I told you at the beginning that when you pursue justice, you get more of Jesus. So I want you to hear what this professor had to say. I interviewed him on my podcast, and this is what he said.
You know, I always tell people, the season I find myself in with this racial justice work is the folks who are skeptical no longer invite me. They don't want to hear from me. I'm too woke, I'm too left, I'm too critical race, whatever. So I'm usually talking to a coalition of the willing these days. And the role I find myself in oftentimes is a cheerleader for people and saying, you can do this. And what I tell them is, there are promises of God that we cannot understand until we're in the fire, until we take a step out for righteousness' sake. We prayed a prayer before we started, and I talked about the passage from Matthew chapter 5. Blessed are you when you are persecuted for righteousness' sake. There's that blessing we cannot experience unless we're persecuted for righteousness' sake. So you talking about, you know, your former students and your current students saying you miss, that is in some small way, I think, part of the blessing that you get to see the lives you impacted and the people who are in your corner.
Now here, professors, this professor.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So if I can respond to that, some of what you just said there. First of all, you're being a cheerleader. I just want to take this time to thank you, because I can tell you that those conversations that we've had over the past week and a half, 2 weeks, that has been a highlight. Like I've been blessed by your words of encouragement. Chokes me up a little bit. You were really there for me. And man, I am so grateful. I mean, I see God working in you powerfully, really powerfully. And then being blessed in the fire, what you were talking about, you know, before all this happened, I have to be honest, my faith I was struggling with faith.
Sure.
It was hanging by a thread there at times. Wow. But man, now I know what it is like. This is really the first time in my life, I think, to experience that blessing in the fire that you're talking about. Yeah. This intensely, and it really has had an impact on me. Wow. So yeah, that's been powerful. And then the support from students.
Did you hear what he said? He said there were times when his faith was hanging on by a thread. And then he took his stand for racial justice, and he felt the nearness of God, the closeness of God in a way he had never felt in his entire life. That's what I want to leave you with today, brothers and sisters. We can get caught up in arguing about justice, making the biblical case, and we should. But at the end of the day, we know in our souls that Jesus wants us to do the best for our neighbors and to pursue justice for them. But fear and intimidation often prevent us. And what I want to say is what it's preventing you from is feeling the presence and the nearness of Jesus. One of the verses I find myself constantly coming back to is Joshua 1, verse 9. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Now understand this 9th verse, that's the 3rd time in the first 9 verses that God has commanded Joshua to be strong and courageous and not to be afraid. But here's the thing, God doesn't just tell us don't be afraid, good luck. God attaches a promise to it. God says, be strong, be courageous, don't be afraid in your pursuit of justice, and guess what? I will be with you wherever you go. But here's where I like the story, because it gets even better. In the Old Testament, Jesus attached a promise to the command, be strong and courageous, do not be afraid. The promise was, I'll be with you wherever you go. In the New Testament, that promise becomes a person, the Emmanuel, God with us. The seal of the promise that God gave to Joshua in the Old Testament is fulfilled in the person of Jesus in the New Testament. And all that tells us, brothers and sisters, is don't be afraid. Don't be intimidated. You'll never have a majority. The crowd will never go with you. But if you are pursuing Jesus, then you must pursue justice. And as you pursue justice, you get more of Jesus. Amen and amen. Thank you.